I'm Lister Sinclair, and tonight we continue our series of programs marking the 30th anniversary of Ideas. An annual highlight of each Ideas season is the CBC Massey Lectures. On Monday nights this spring, we're looking at the Massey Lecturers of the past 10 years. Each lecture series is condensed into a one-hour program. Tonight, we'll hear the Massey Lectures of 1988. Here's how I introduced them. On Ideas, the 1988 Massey Lectures about media, propaganda, and democracy, given by Noam Chomsky, Institute Professor in the Departments of Philosophy and Linguistics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology in Boston. Professor Chomsky is an internationally renowned scholar, the leading theorist in the field of structural linguistics, and the author of some 30 books, both technical books in the field of linguistics and books addressed to a general audience, which examine political issues, focusing especially on the place of the United States in international affairs. He is particularly concerned with what Americans find out through their mass media, more properly called, in Professor Chomsky's view, the elite media. His approach to this question involves a massive amount of research. His books are noted for the mountain of data they contain. Throughout his work, Professor Chomsky has based his conclusions on a close analysis of specific cases, but his real interest is in the larger issues that the specific cases point to. What are the enduring institutional characteristics of our media system, the system we call the free press, and how do those characteristics affect what we think we know? The philosopher and theologian Reinhold Niebuhr concluded that ordinary people were hardly capable of understanding the world or drawing reasonable conclusions without being subjected to a set of what he called necessary illusions, what we'd call propaganda, constructed by the intellectual elites. The system for managing this has turned out to be the mass media. The title of the 1988 Massey Lectures is Necessary Illusions. Noam Chomsky.
Let me begin with a report in a church-based Latin American journal, datelined São Paulo, Brazil. The headline reads, Brazilian Bishops Support Plan to Democratize Media. The report describes a proposal, which is now being debated in the Brazilian Constituent Assembly, that would open up Brazil's powerful and highly concentrated media to citizen participation. The concept of democratizing the media has no real meaning within the terms of political discourse in the United States. In fact, the phrase has a paradoxical or even vaguely subversive ring to it. Citizen participation would be considered an infringement on freedom of the press. It would be considered a blow struck against the independence of the media that would distort the mission that they have undertaken to inform the public without fear or favor. Now, that reaction merits some thought. Underlying it are beliefs as to how the media do function, and also as to how they should function within our democratic systems. There are also certain implicit conceptions of the nature of democracy. Let's have a look at these topics in turn. The standard image of media performance was expressed by Judge Gerfein in a decision in which he rejected efforts by the U.S. government to bar publication of the Pentagon Papers. In that decision, he said that we have a cantankerous press, an obstinate press, a ubiquitous press, and it must be suffered by those in authority in order to preserve the even greater values of freedom of expression and the right of the people to know. Columnist Anthony Lewis of the New York Times commented on this decision and pointed out that the media were not always as independent, vigilant, and defiant of authority as they are today. But, he says, in the Vietnam and Watergate eras, the media learned to exercise the power to root about in our national life, exposing what they deem right for exposure without regard to external pressures. That, too, is a commonly held belief. There has been much debate about the media during this period, but it does not deal with the problem of democratizing the media and freeing them from the constraints of state and private power. Rather, the issue that is debated is whether the media have not exceeded proper bounds in escaping such constraints. The question is whether they have perhaps even threatened the existence of democratic institutions in their contentious and irresponsible defiance of authority. There was an important study on these topics by the Trilateral Commission in 1975. It was a study on what they called governability of democracies, and the commission, which is made up of elite elements from Japan, the United States, and Europe, the commission concluded that the media have become a notable new source of national power. This, they said, is one aspect of an excess of democracy that contributes to the reduction of governmental authority at home and a consequent decline in the influence of democracy abroad. This general crisis of democracy, the commission held, results from the efforts of previously marginalized sectors of the population to organize and to press their demands. By doing so, they create an overload that prevents the democratic process from functioning properly. The American commentator, Samuel Huntington, a professor at Harvard University, pointed out that in earlier times, President Truman had been able to govern the country with the cooperation of a relatively small number of Wall Street lawyers and bankers. In this period, then, there was no crisis of democracy, but in the 1960s, the crisis developed and reached serious proportions. The Trilateral Commission study, therefore, urges more moderation in democracy to mitigate what they call the excess of democracy and thus overcome the crisis. Putting it in plain terms, the general public must be reduced to their traditional apathy and obedience and driven from the arena of political debate and action if democracy is to survive. This study reflects the perceptions and values of liberal elites from the United States, Europe, and Japan. It includes the leading figures of the Carter administration, President Carter himself, in fact. On the right, the perception is that democracy is threatened by the organizing efforts of those groups that are called the special interests. That's an interesting concept of contemporary political rhetoric. It refers to workers, farmers, women, youth, the elderly, the handicapped, ethnic minorities, in fact, to the general population. One should not be misled by Reagan's landslide electoral victories. In fact, Reagan won the votes of under a third of the electorate, and of the voters, a clear majority hoped that his legislative programs would not be enacted. Meanwhile, half the population continue to hold that the government is run by a few big interests looking out for themselves, as polls regularly show. The Reagan phenomena, in fact, may offer a kind of foretaste of where capitalist democracies are moving in general, with a number of crucial features: the elimination of labor unions, of independent media, of political associations, and more generally the elimination of forms of popular organization that interfere with domination of the state by concentrated private power. Well, let's return to the media, which are charged with having fanned the ominous flames of excess of democracy. The Trilateral Commission concludes, I'm now quoting them, that broader interests of society and government require that if journalists do not impose standards of professionalism upon themselves, then the alternative could well be regulation by the government to the end of restoring a balance between government and media.